mining companies have faced a wide range of issues, ranging from health and safety concerns for their employees, logistic stoppages, reductions in production, and even shutdowns in some cases. So as the economic crisis continues to unfold, uncertainties arise, and all eyes are set on China, of course, which imports the majority of Africa's mining resources. And today we'll ask three main questions. Is it business as usual for an industry operating in remote areas and used to disruptions? How are state and the industry's interests aligned, and what lessons can be learned from the future of this industry in Africa? And to discuss this today, here are our panelists. Daphne Mashile-Nkosi, Executive Chairperson at Kalagadi Manganese, Ismael Diakite, Deputy Managing Director at Société Minière de Bokeh, and Bob Bastos, Partner at Asafo & Co. We also have, during this webinar, the insights of two very special guests, Jacob Grierson, Partner at Asafo & Co, and Gaelle Arenson, Editor-in-Chief at Jeune Afrique Business Plus. But first, here is an opening presentation prepared by Christian Mion, Senior Partner at Ernst & Young. Mr. Mion has extensive knowledge and experience in the mining and metals industry, as well as in emerging markets in Africa, notably Guinea. Mr. Mion, welcome. Mr. Mion, can you hear us? I will just ask you to bear with us. Mr. Mion, can you hear us?
Yeah, I hear you, and normally you should hear me now.
We hear you very well. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks a lot, Anne-Marie, and good morning to everyone. Just to start, I would like to say that I will be a little bit iconoclast, and I have some straightforward statements to open the road for the panel discussion. The focus is Africa, and I think that Africa is rather different than what's going on in the rest of the world. And I will explain a little bit what I constate, what I see every day, and make some conclusion or some open question for the rest of the panel after. First of all, I've been really amazed about how Africa globally handled the COVID, especially in terms of resilience, adaptation, and reorganization. And I think clearly for me that it's a real lesson for the rest of the world, again, from my point of view. I would like also to remind that it's a second large unweighted and unwanted exogenous shock, but much more easily digested, okay? And the question behind is, does it prove that Africa is more resilient and changing? If we go back to the commodity price shock of 2013, it's the second one, and I think Africa is much more resilient than it was in the past. If you go to the next slide, you will see that there were some open questions in the topics we were supposed to cover. One was health and safety, and COVID is clearly part of health and safety. And today, if you look at the radar risk EY is issuing in September every year, you see that for many years, health and safety is not a major risk because it's already part of the DNA of the mining companies. Okay, remember the old time where you had panels at the entry of the mine saying 400 days without injury or casualties and so on and so on. So safety and health is part of the DNA of the mining, and there's no discussion about that. So COVID is just a new one, a new illness like AIDS, and it's handled globally. If you see the figures, yesterday Glencore announced 6 cases in KCC in the DRC, while the Chilean mining industry was announcing thousands and thousands of copper workers having fallen ill in Chile. So with a big impact on the copper production. We also raised the issue of logistics. But due to infrastructure, due to road, due to safety, due to security and so on, logistics in Africa is a little bit particular in the sense that we have over inventories, I would say. So we have a lot of spare parts, a lot of chemicals. Usually in the warehouses, we have between 3 and 4 months of reserve of things to prevent any disruption. If you take Guinea, for example, you know that in the rainy season, going to the gold area in Sigiri, it's very difficult to bring the cyanide over there. So we have, before the raining season coming, the mining companies are over warehousing, I would say. So so logistic again is not a major topic due to COVID for me. So if you go to next slide. What I've seen, and I have been very, very active during March, April, May, and June with a lot of mining operation in Africa, mainly in DRC, Burkina Faso, Ivory Coast, Guinea, and yes, DRC, I mentioned it, Mali also. I've been impressed the adaptation of the companies and the ministries going digital, I would say. I saw that the arrival of Zoom, Teams, and so on, and it was really the space of adaptation for going digital was really incredible. If you go to statistics regarding the COVID, and if you look to the Johns Hopkins University statistics, you will see that the number of cases in Africa is relatively low, and the lethality rate is really, really low. Exception made of South Africa, which is different. Okay, so again, COVID is not as it is in the rest of the world. And so this is why when I was proposed the topic, I mentioned there's no real issue with COVID in Africa. So if we go now to the next slide, we ask about also commodity producing countries. On my side, what I see is that nearly all producing sites, and I hope that my friend Ismael will confirm, nearly all producing sites are going well, and it's business as usual on the mining side. If you take the gold site in Ivory Coast, in Mali, everything is run as it was. Okay, and I would like to finish with a little unfair question, but it was also asked yesterday in France regarding companies firing people. Is the COVID the real reason of shutting down or cooling down operations in Africa? My feeling is that sometimes it's also an opportunity seized to pace down operation, waiting for better world global conditions and times, and making some economies and putting pressure on some government. So these are the statements I wanted to issue to open the gate of the discussion after. And again, I'm usually iconoclast, so I try to stay faithful with my reputation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Mion, for indeed opening the floor and our discussion here. You've mentioned, of course, amongst other things, Africans' resiliency and capacity for adaptation through notably digitalization, but you've also raised a question. Is COVID-19 the real reason for shutting down or scaling down in Africa? And maybe we'll answer this during our webinar. Thank you very much there. Okay, so now time for the question of our first survey that will appear very shortly on your screens. Do you think pandemic risk will push up the cost of projects in the mining industry over the long term? Please do not hesitate to be precise with your answers in the Q&A sections. So step 1, you answer yes, no, or don't know, and then step 2, go into the Q&A section with details on your answer there. Also, I just want you to remember the hashtag ACF Digital Events. Please make good use of that. Contribute to our discussion on social media. All right, now to our panel to talk about financing and how we can prepare for the day after. So here is a longer now introduction of our panelists. We are in the company of Daphne Mashile-Nkosi. She's the executive chairperson at Kalagadi Manganese. Mrs. Mashile-Nkosi is also the chairman of the Women's Development Bank Trust and chairperson of the Jeune Afrique Initiative, Women Working for Change. We also are with Ismael Diakite, who is Deputy Managing Director at Société Minière de Bokeh. Prior to this position, Mr. Diakite was a member of the Rio Tinto's Executive Committee and Chief Executive of Rio Tinto in Guinea. He's also served as Chairman of the Guinea Private Sector Forum and President of the Guinea Chamber of Mines. And we are also with Bob Bastos, who is partner at Asafo & Co. Mr. Bastos specializes in structuring, negotiating, and developing energy, infrastructure, and natural resources projects in sub-Sahara Africa. Mr. Bastos has substantial experience in negotiating and restructuring complex agreements, commercial and financial debts, and solving disputes between state-owned companies and corporate entities. So welcome to all our panelists here. And I would first like to ask you, how has this current crisis impacted your activities? And I'll start with you, Mrs. Mashile-Nkosi. And I would like to ask you, how did you handle operations during the lockdown period? And indeed, how has this affected your production, please?
Thank you very much, Anna-Marie. Good afternoon, fellow panelists, and good afternoon, participants as well. I think I just want, before I can actually talk about how COVID has impacted our operations, I just want to correct the stats in terms of COVID-19. As we speak today, we've done 2 million, plus minus 2 million tests that we've done as South Africa. 2 million tests, testing people conducted. We have 224,000 identified positive cases. We have 106,000 total recoveries. We have 3,600 deaths. And as we speak today, probably we increasing the number of deaths by plus minus 200. And I think I just want to say that given the number of tests that we have, it does give us the answers. But the number of other countries that we know around the frontline, countries like Lesotho, Swaziland, and so on, they actually don't test the numbers that we have. And therefore, their numbers, of course, would be low simply because they actually don't know how many people they have. The impact of COVID-19, I think South Africa was shut down in March. And because of that, it was a new normal. Suddenly, we had to actually buy sanitizers, masks, social distancing, and the ore market, simply because China was in lockdown when we were not in lockdown. So when we were in lockdown in March, China was opening up. And as you know that in the manganese sector, China is our biggest customer. The shutdown in South Africa coincided with China opening up, and therefore it resulted in the manganese ore shortages globally, as South Africa represents more than 50% of the semi-carbonate ore. Because of that, there was increase in demand from China, and therefore it pushes the price very high. And because there was a scramble for manganese that will be coming from South Africa, from China, it pushed the price higher. But after 2 months, we saw the stockpiles that were actually stockpiled in China. Just as a matter of interest, if you look at the 1-year price trend, last year, May 2019, the price of manganese was sitting at $5, $6.20, and we're sitting today at the same time at 30 June at just around $5 or $4.90. You can actually see the impact of COVID. But it didn't only push the prices in terms of how we were actually going to supply. We suddenly were sitting at 33%. Government actually allowed all those that have smelters like us, we have a sinter plant, to operate at 33%. Of course, if you operate at 33%, your production would be lower. Not only that, social distancing, the new normal became new requests in terms of transport, in terms of the number of people that were not sure what this COVID was all about, and therefore our production went down. But we suddenly adapted, as my fellow panelist has said, we actually picked up, and in the first 3 months of COVID, we actually made more money than the first 3 months of the year. What were the challenges? The challenges that we have as of today is that we have a lot of people in quarantine. We have 1 positive case at our mine who is on self-quarantine at home and not at the mine. But at the mine, we do not have cases at all because we practice social distancing, we screen people on a daily basis, and we make sure that people have masks, people have sanitizers, people wash their hands at any given intervention.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We'll go back on it in more details, but I quickly want to go to Mr. Diakite now. Please, Mr. Diakite, can you tell us about the impact on COVID-19 now in Guinea, first on the Guinean mining sector, and then more in details on your production, please? Mr. Diakite, I think you just need to be unmuted there.
So thank you very much for everyone, and I'm happy to be there and to talk about the COVID-19 because we as bauxite mining leaders in the country, at the same time leading the Chamber of Mine of Guinea, we have been at the forefront of this fight against this pandemic. And the big impact somehow was big on not only on the production, but also downstream on all the activities that we are doing regarding, for instance, the sea transport and so on and so forth. Well, when you talk about COVID, you talk about people first. The mining sector is the second biggest employer in Guinea. And with this pandemic, we have first to take into account the well-being and the health of our people. As Mr. Christian Mion was saying, well, health and safety is somehow the DNA of the mining sector because be with pandemic or not, we are always putting in place all the measures, all the capacity to contain any epidemic that is hitting our site and most importantly, our communities and people. The experience of Ebola outbreak in 2014 was a good ground of learnings. So somehow I'm not saying that we're ready to welcome the pandemic, COVID-19, but we had in place all the tools, capacity, expertise to contain the epidemic. The first thing was to prevent any disruption in our productions by putting people.
Been affected actually.
yeah, the production was not highly reflected because not only we had the tools to manage people, to put them in rotations, in shifts, but also we have a lot of stockpiles because we have to predict any undesirable events that can disrupt the productions and therefore disrupt the sea transport and the evacuation of the minerals. So the impact on the production was not that high. On the value chain of our productions up to the clients, I would say that we were around 7 to 13% of a loss of productions. Not because of only the pandemic, but we are also in the running seasons. The running season here is very high. Therefore, the bauxite contains a certain level of humidities that will contribute to slow down a bit the productions. So the impact was not significant, but definitely we were able to contain not only on the production, but also on the logistics and on people.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I now want to turn to Mr. Bastos. So as a mining lawyer, have you seen any impact on implementation of projects and contracts? And how do you see the day after?
Thank you, Anne-Marie. So I would like to pick up a couple of things that has been said. Definitely the mining industry. I mean, the mining is resilient by essence. Definitely. I mean, when you operate from a remote location, when you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis on supply, export, energy shortage, I mean, it's your day-to-day. So crisis is your day-to-day. Second, as Mr. Diakite said, some of the African countries had to deal with health issues, and Ebola is definitely help miners to integrate this kind of risk. So that's the part that can be handled and has been handled. But as Ms. Mashile said, you had two main factors that impacted and then were not foreseeable. I mean, social distancing measures. Miners know how to operate mines, but did they know how to operate mines with 1/3 of miners? And it had to definitely it was a big shift. Second, external factors, it has been said, unforeseeable slowdown of the economy. I mean, it's an external factor, and you can be prepared technically as a miner, but again, mining plans have not been done on that basis. So how do you deal with that? So what we see on the project at the moment, I mean, I think the challenge is still ahead. As Ms. Mashile said, we have probably very limited data at the moment. So I think miners are dealing with day-to-day issues, but probably challenges are still ahead. As to contract, I'm not spending many time on that, but of course, it has been heavily commented. Force majeure issues was a critical focus. Even though we didn't see at this stage major turbulence, but we, as lawyers, we have been, of course, we had discussions with our clients asking about force majeure. But again, on these issues, turbulence is still ahead. So as to the day after, again, two things: uncertainties, definitely, and consequences. When we say uncertainties, what will be the effect of slowdown and closure? Every day we are announcing new COVID cases, and how to deal with a second wave. Second, the market. I mean, there is a big drop now. The market are recovering due to stimulus plans, but again, everyone is talking about global recession. So how can we deal with that? And consequences, what we already see and what can be expected. We can probably come back on that later on during the webinar, but the consequences are there, and there are metrics to see that, but we'll come back later on that. Thank
you. Thank you very much, Mr. Bastos, for indeed highlighting the fact that there are still many uncertainties as to related to this current pandemic. I would just like to go back to you, Mr. Diakite, because in November last year, you have secured one of the sector's biggest deals ever, the extraction license for blocks 1 and 2 at Simandou Nord. And this, of course, will require a substantial investment of around $15 billion and, of course, generate unprecedented revenues for your country, Guinea. So the stakes, we understand, are very high for you, but also for your country. Nonetheless, this deal actually happened around 4 months before the kickstart of the pandemic. So I want to ask you, how do you foresee this significant investment in this current context? And again, I would just ask you to unmute your microphone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Once again, you know, our learnings from our bauxite operations is very relevant to what we are planning to do in Simandou. The business model that we have used in Borges somehow can be replicated in Simandou, despite the fact that Simandou has bigger size, of course, and also cover the whole country because it starts from the coast, Atlantic coast, up to the northeast of Guinea towards Ivory Coast. So in terms of capacity, expertise, we rely a lot on what our Chinese shareholder can give us contributions, not only for mobilizing the funding of the project through some equity funding, but also they can contribute a lot for the debt financing. Let alone the expertise that our main contractors and off-takers will bring in through their commitment in building the rails, building the ports, and operating the mine. For the port, we have no doubt that the shareholder, the major shareholders, which is Winning International Group based in Singapore, has a large capacity of shipping, the huge quantity of the 80 million tons of iron ore we want to ship. And we also know that Yantai Port, who is one of the main port constructions, river ports and seaport constructor in China, will be contributing to fast track the construction of the service port and also the deep port. CRCC is well known over the world. They have huge expertise in building in harsh conditions, rail, track, bridges, culverts, and all these, I would say, major infrastructure that we need to operate a rail, a huge, almost 700 kilometers rails that we are going to build. Yeah, maybe our weakness will be on the mine side, but for that, we are working to make sure that we mobilize all the expertise. I will say this time for block 1 and 2, we are very optimistic. The market will be challenging. As you know, by 2015, 2025, the market will be somehow a bit overloaded, China being the main market, but we are aiming to put on the market the best quality of product from Simandou. This is the untapped richest resources on the world. Therefore, we are committed to deliver it.
Thank you very much. So very optimistic. And we have to say that this is a deal that's 20 years in the making. So that's very significant. Now, looking ahead, what will the future look like? Well, let's look at financing, for instance. We all know that multilateral banks have been quite hesitant when lending recently to mining companies, many of which have now decided to turn or to seek capital markets and investment funds for financing. And I would like to go back to you, please, Mrs. Mashile-Nkosi, to ask you whether you think that this crisis can impact on this trend and which financing options do you seek, will you seek in the future?
Thank you very much, Anna Marie. Again, COVID-19 was, for us, a blessing in disguise, in the sense that we had been in development for some time. The Kalahari manganese, which is the largest manganese sinter plant in the world in terms of output. Every other manganese player in the world produces less than 200,000 tons or 300,000. We produce 3 million tons. And we were right at the time when we were actually starting our production and ramping up. And I think it has actually worked for us. As we speak today, the companies actually we don't need money. We can, wash our face. We can pay our debt. Moving forward in terms of Africa representing almost 90% of world reserves in terms of manganese between ourselves and West Africa. And therefore there's a demand for manganese. And from where I am sitting, if you look at South Africa only, they've actually given us a 500 billion COVID, money that will be actually put into infrastructure that will service the COVID pandemic, but also in addition to that, infrastructure of about 500 billion. And I think it's so in all other countries where people are putting money into infrastructure. For as long as there's infrastructure development, there'll be a requirement for manganese. Manganese tracks steel, and for as long as there's infrastructure, there's steel. For as long as there's steel, there's manganese. We see in the short to medium term, we see an increase in the manganese price. We see an increase in the demand for manganese simply because of steel and restructuring and so on and so forth, particularly for Europe, given the fact that they've gone through the pandemic. For us, probably next year, rebuilding and actually putting together infrastructure. So we actually are not asking for funding. We do not need financing options. But if you look at what South Africa is doing, development funding institutions have been given money by the government to actually assist those companies that are struggling, because there are those SMEs that cannot fund their people because some of the people are at home simply because there was a lockdown, and government through the unemployment insurance fund, they were actually paying salaries and subsidizing some of those companies. So from that point of view, there's a lot of money that has been put into the South African economy to assist SMEs by the development funding institutions that are there. But over and above that, we don't see the need from a Kalahari perspective to actually raise funding.
Thank you very much. Now let's have a look at international arbitration, and I would like to introduce our next keynote speaker, who will be giving us a presentation on this topic. His name is Mr. Grierson, Jacob Grierson, and he's partner at Mashile-Nkosi, where he represents clients from numerous countries in a broad range of international arbitrations, including disputes arising out of the mining, oil and gas, construction, pharmaceutical, telecom, and internet industries. Welcome, Mr. Grierson.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. Can you hear me okay?
Very well, yes.
Fantastic.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be here with such distinguished co-panelists and such a great group attending. There are an enormous number of arbitrations relating to mining in Africa. I say this not only based on our firm's experience of such arbitrations, which have kept us very busy, but also based on the statistics. My first slide, if we can turn to that, shows the increase in the number of African parties to arbitrations under the rules of the ICC, which is the world's leading international arbitration institution, over the past 15 years. My second slide shows the increase in the number of what the ICC call energy-related disputes, again from the ICC and for the same period. And this, although described as energy, includes a very large proportion of mining disputes. These so-called energy-related disputes made up 16% of all ICC arbitrations in 2019. Now, how will things change as a result of COVID-19? Logically, there should be a significant increase in the number of disputes. Force majeure issues are notoriously hard to resolve amicably, and there's likely to be an increase in what's been described as resource nationalism of the type that we saw in a number of countries, including Zambia and Tanzania, following the falls in metals and minerals prices following their peak in 2012. On the other hand, companies whose finances are tighter than before should logically be looking to settle their disputes amicably in order to minimize legal spend, just as they did in a much broader context following the 2007 to 2012 financial crisis. And they now have the advantage of a growing band of highly experienced mediators to help them to do just that. But that will, to some extent, be counterbalanced by the significant rise in third-party funding of arbitration claims, as investors realize quite how lucrative such funding can be, and as jurisdictions around the world relax the laws that once prohibited such funding. So there should, in my view, be a significant increase in the number of arbitrations relating to African mining. The question will be, what kind of arbitrations will they be? Will they be handled by the long-established arbitral institutions based in Europe, the US, and Asia, the ones you see on this map, the ICC in Paris, the LCIA in London, ICSID in Washington, DC, SIAC in Singapore, and a few others? Or will they now start to be handled by the newer African arbitral institutions? There are now over 70 such institutions on the continent. The principal ones, or some of the principal ones, are shown on this map. Some of them are truly excellent, although I should declare an interest as I'm involved in the governing bodies of CIMAC in Casablanca and MIAC in Mauritius. Despite the impressive number of African arbitral institutions, users of arbitration have been pretty slow to adopt the idea of arbitrating in Africa. Why is that? First of all, many African jurisdictions have still today badly outdated arbitration laws. Secondly, many African courts have issued bad judgments and decisions in which they've interfered in arbitrations and in which they've refused to enforce arbitral awards that really ought to have been enforced. And thirdly, not all of the 70 arbitral institutions have done such a great job. But the situation has been improving recently. There have been new arbitration laws based on international best practice. For example, in South Africa, the International Arbitration Act 2017 and AHADA's new Uniform Act on the Law of Arbitration in the same year. There have been much better court decisions from judges who have now understood the importance of supporting arbitration rather than interfering with it, most notably in Mauritius over the course of the last 10 or so years. And African arbitral institutions have improved their practice and their rules, and most recently the CCJA, which is, as you no doubt know, not only the Supreme Court of AHADA, but also the leading arbitral institution in West Africa, has revised its rules to make up for some perceived deficiencies in the previous version. Will COVID-19 make any difference to all this? The most immediate change brought about by COVID-19 in this respect is the rise of the so-called remote arbitration hearing. Instead of everybody flying into Paris to spend a very intense week or 10 days arguing the merits of a case, we're now starting to see remote hearings with even cross-examination of witnesses done by Zoom. It actually works pretty well, and I believe it will get better as we see even more technical innovation than we have over just the past few months. And this, of course, will make the place of the hearing much less important. So users should be more willing to arbitrate in Africa than they were before. It really doesn't make any difference whether their remote hearing is in Libreville or Paris. It's a remote hearing either way. But the place of arbitration means more than just the place of the hearing. It determines which national courts will supervise the arbitration. So the challenge now is for African courts to show that they can be trusted to supervise arbitrations. Personally, I believe that many courts around the continent are fully up to this challenge. I say that based on my experience of working with judges in Morocco and Mauritius, and also based on the fact that other jurisdictions outside of Africa, including my own England, as you might be able to tell from the accent, have moved from being arbitration unfriendly jurisdictions to being one of the most arbitration friendly ones today in the course of just 2 decades. So I believe, ladies and gentlemen, that the future for arbitration in Africa is bright, and it's bright including for mining disputes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Mr. Grierson. Very interesting and insightful presentation there, and especially on the rise of remote hearings and how this will impact on jurisdictions as well. So before moving on, I would just like us to take a quick look at the results of our first survey. You'll have that on your screen. So the question was, do you think pandemic risk will push up the cost of projects in the mining industry over the long term? You answered yes at 60%, no 29%, and 12 of you are unsure. Thank you very much for that. And here is a second question for our next survey. You'll see that on your screen as well very shortly. Here it is. Do you think that the COVID-19 crisis will ultimately lead to positive change in the mining industry? And again, we'll remind you that you can talk in more details about your answer in our Q&A section, and I'll reveal very shortly the results of the second poll. But first, so after hearing such an extensive and well put together presentation, I would like to ask you whether there have been any points mentioned by Mr. Grierson that you find especially relevant for your business. For instance, this foreseeable increase in arbitration and disputes. Are you experiencing, any of that? And maybe I can go straight to you, Mrs. Mashile-Nkosi. What are your thoughts on what has just been said?
I think I tend to agree with him, particularly on force majeure and arbitration, because suddenly all of us had to actually give our contractors force majeure. Because of that, some would want to actually arbitrate so that you can deal with the issue. And I think issues of jurisdiction, where some of the development funding institutions, their jurisdiction is in London, which makes it very difficult to actually litigate if you're in Johannesburg. And I think we've gone through a court process remotely, and we've done very well where, the judge and everybody was actually participating. And I think I would tend to agree that things are going to be much easier. We're now actually beginning to embrace digitization, because some of us were technologically challenged. We're not sure that we can still embrace digitization. It has actually fast-tracked digitization in terms of, I've not been to the office for the past 2 months, but I'm doing what I have to do on a daily basis. And remote hearings, places of arbitration, yes, it's no longer going to be British law, London, where people have to spend monies going there. And I think, yeah, I do agree. Yes, I also do agree that, for instance, in South Africa, we do have the arbitration of South Africa, AFSA, which is very matured. Everybody would go there because, you have people who are actually competent, who actually, do run with the arbitration process. So, yeah, I tend to agree that it is actually a blessing. It's going to change, but also it's going to change how we've been running business. It's going to change how we've been doing things. It's going to change most of the things in terms of whether jurisdiction doesn't matter, where you spend 2 weeks trying to negotiate a contract simply because they're saying English law versus South African law. So those issues are no longer going to be that important.
Thank you very much. And what are your thoughts on the subject, Mr. Diakite?
I quite agree with.
Oh, sorry, we've lost you there, but I'm sure your mic will be back on very shortly.
The resource nationalism is, for me, the key area of arbitration. If you take, for instance, anything related to the government share controls into the mining activities and also into the infrastructure component of the mining activities is something that we are really experiencing by a lot of lengthy discussions about how much share the government should hold, and how these shares should be planned in terms of, sometimes they require free carry, sometimes they want historical cost, sometimes they want market value, and that's a source of a lot of discussions, and sometimes can lead to arbitration. Same thing for the local content. And more, the government is requiring more employment, more training, more locals to be promoted. And in addition to that, land occupation and community development are always governed now by a lot of requests, a lot of expectation from the stakeholders in terms of how many money are you going to plan to inject into the community development, and so on and so forth. So these are some area where dispute can emerge, and where the government can keep
Thank you.
his positions, and then lead to some kind of arbitration. But the truth is, when you deal with the government, you have to bear in mind now that what was the paradigm in the 60s or 70s is not the same in the new centuries. So that's something which we have to bear in mind when you are engaging with the government, in order to avoid any arbitration case.
Thank you very much, Mr. Diakite. I'm very aware of the time here, so I would just ask you to be as short with your answers as possible, please, so that we can go through everything. And I would like to go back to you, Mrs. Mashile-Nkosi. And what you've just said, Mr. Diakite, is a perfect introduction to talk about maybe a reshuffle of the relationship between states and mining businesses. Mrs. Mashile-Nkosi, you mentioned earlier on this major recovery plan. I believe it's 500 billion rands that the South African states put on the table. That's around 25 billion euros. That's even around 10% of the country's GDP. And I wanted to ask you whether this crisis, in fact, will maybe shift the relationship between investor and the state.
Thank you very much. Yes, it is, because suddenly the government is actually putting a lot of money into the economy, and therefore restarting the economy. And of course, the power play in terms of investor-state relations will bring them together, because they will be acting in the best interest of the people of the country. And I just want to go back to what Ismael spoke about in terms of the relationship between community and stakeholder relations, in terms of the fact that people were not going to work for 3 months simply because of COVID-19. So there's more, requirements from a community development point of view, that companies must begin to work together with government in terms of resuscitating the local economies where they're actually participating in. For instance, where I am in the Northern Cape, I have a responsibility of actually working with government during COVID-19 to make sure that we assist where they did not plan, for instance, to actually put water, fresh water, so that the hygiene, that we require every 10 minutes for people to wash their hands is actually assisted by the mining sector in that particular area. So yes, it has, because remember, sometimes when people fund you, you are actually donor-driven in terms of your plans. And therefore, the state coming into play, we are in a better position to actually deliver in terms of assisting the mandate of community development from a state's point of view, as opposed to an investor telling you what to do because it is actually their money. So the relations are definitely going to change.
Thank you very much. And now to you, Mr. Bastos. So we've heard different cases here, but there is a trend really sifting through, which is that this crisis, in a way, has had a positive impact in strengthening the relationship between states and businesses. But I would like to ask you whether this is representative of what is happening across the entire continent.
Yeah, thank you. Probably just one comment to react on what Jacob said. Definitely, I mean, the COVID is a big step forward, and for remote hearings and arbitration. I mean, the main critics that have been said to the CCGA, for example, was justice for big companies, and as Mrs. Mashile said, for a SME to go to Abidjan might be costly. So that's just to react on that is probably is a 5-year jump because of the COVID. Just to go back to state-investor relationship. And how it can evolve, and to get back to the dispute thing. I mean, I wish I could answer to that question, but because on the short term, you know, state and investors are very focused on managing the situation on a daily basis. So on the very short term, everyone is very focused on managing COVID. But midterm, I think we can anticipate 3 things. Let's say the revenue issues, project issues, and probably social issues. On revenue, while companies are trying to manage cash and anticipate financing issues, states are facing needs in terms of revenue. So we can probably anticipate strong discussions on revenues and returns. Second, from a project perspective, we didn't talk much about that, but again, Ms. Mashile and Mr. Diakite raised the issue how companies will perform, how get to the production targets, the sale targets, how do you comply with schedule, how do you comply with CAPEX commitments. So what does it mean? It means that we can probably anticipate discussions about how the companies perform their obligations, and state will probably want to engage discussion on that. And it's probably a reaction on what Mr. Mion said. The question was is that really, what is COVID and what is not COVID? We don't have the answer to that, but that will be definitely a point that will be raised probably by the state. And last but not least, social. We are talking about a huge job cuts. Sorry, for example, in Zambia and elsewhere. So definitely the social issue will be a major one. And just to end up on one thing, what recommendation? I mean, someone said one day states are like bankers, they don't like surprises. So we just strongly recommend to engage with states in an open manner, but sometimes it's more easy to say than to do. But
thank you very much, Mr. Bastos, for opening up here, you know, the areas to different countries other than South Africa and Guinea. So far we've mentioned 2 main commodities with our key guests, manganese and bauxite, but I would like us to take a look at gold. So the continent is literally, and pardon the pun, a gold mine, exporting tens of billions of dollars worth of gold annually from 46 countries. And our next expert is going to help us assess this sector. Her name is Gaelle Arenson, and she is an expert in gold. She is currently the editor-in-chief at Jeune Afrique Business Plus. She has extensive knowledge of the mining sector. She was notably in charge of Africa Mining Intelligence and Mining Insiders collections at Indigo Publication. Mrs. Arenson, welcome.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Anne-Marie.
So we have to say that gold is a special commodity, isn't it? It has a very particular set of trends, and this is the reason why we actually felt that we needed, an expert for a focus on it. So can you please start by telling us how gold prices have been impacted by this crisis, and what do you see as the new normal emerging?
So, hi, Anne-Marie. Thank you again. Well, what is the new normal in gold? Definitely the fantastic price hike we've seen over the last few months. As you well know, in times of economic downturn, gold always plays the role of safe haven investment, and there's been no exception to that rule today. We've just gone beyond the $1,800 per ounce mark a couple of days ago. Analysts are thinking we're going to go beyond the 1,900 mark. Analysts are also even talking about the $2,000 per ounce mark. And this, of course, is not correlated to an increase of demand. It's correlated with prolonged instability on the worldwide level because of that pandemic.
Thank you very much. So this is all about the markets, but on the ground, what is the situation and how have the gold mines been affected by the crisis?
So it's pretty much like Christian Mion was saying earlier. On an operational perspective, it was pretty much business as usual, and just another disease for many of the miners. I'm thinking especially in West Africa. I know that in South Africa, I'm thinking especially of the Mponeng underground gold mine. They had cases of COVID, but pretty much elsewhere, gold mines have been able to carry on operating as usual. Often gold mines and other mines for that matter are situated in isolated areas in the middle of the desert, in the middle of the forest, and they are accustomed to functioning autonomously. So we haven't seen that great a change. Down the value chain, of course, gold hasn't got the same issues as with base metals. There's no question there of transporting big volumes and of recoursing to maritime transport. Gold miners have gold ingots, doré bar, carried by planes. So of course, passengers plane flights were interrupted, but that did not stop gold miners from actually having recourse to cargo flights or even chartering their own flights to export the gold. And finally, gold refineries have had very little disruption. The Ren refinery in South Africa did not stop. And the three big gold refineries in Switzerland, they only stopped about a couple of weeks and they're back on board right now. So I would say that the gold industry is one of the least affected industries by COVID right now.
So a particular resilience, little disruption. We've actually seen signs of vitality with mergers and acquisitions. Can you give us some examples?
Absolutely. That's been a strong trend within the gold mining sector for about 2 years now, since the big Barrick Ren Gold merger. The consolidation of the sector is at work. And certainly during the COVID, we've seen that activity carrying on. I've got 3 examples for you that are really eloquent. Nord Gold purchased some 20% of Cardinal Resources, that's a junior miner in Ghana, and that was partially buying participation from Gold Fields for some $37 million. We've also seen Teranga Gold in Senegal buying Barrick's Massawa gold deposit in that country for $400 million. And of course, we've seen Endeavour Mining doing a friendly takeover of Semafo, and that's a $1 billion deal that has just been closed, making actually Endeavour the #1 gold producer in West Africa right now. So merger and acquisitions and consolidation globally of the sector has carried on during COVID.
Mm-hmm. And so we're really here as well to have a glimpse at the day after and what, according to you, can be the long-term consequences of COVID-19 on the gold industry.
Well, I think like looking at what's happening, the persistent uncertainty in the US, in Brazil, concerning the pandemic, in India, which is a big gold buyer, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, where clearly those governments there have not managed to gain back control on the pandemic. I think we're still in to see further price hikes of the gold price. Again, I was mentioning those highs that analysts are looking at. So on the longer run, I think we're going to see a revival of investors' interest, particularly, I would say, of private equity, private investors. Over the last decade or so, private equity has been known to foray into gold, into mining financing, and gold in particular. And I think now that that price hike is going to attract more interest. Incidentally, the three companies I mentioned earlier, they are all backed by very prominent private investors. Nordgold is actually backed by Russian billionaire Alexei Mordashov, who's also head of the Severstar Group, mining group. And more interestingly, Teranga counts as first #1 shareholder David Mimran, who's and also the Mimran Group from Jean-Claude Mimran's sugar billionaire. And of course, Endeavour is held 24% held by Naguib Sawiris, which is Egypt's billionaire, former telecoms tycoon. And it's very interesting because for the example with Mr. Sawiris, he's invested over half of his fortune in gold mining over the last 10 years or so, within the framework of the merger between Endeavour and Semaphore. He's just put back on the table another $100 million, that was a couple of days ago, just in order not to have his shareholding diluted. So in a nutshell, I think we really have to watch out on that scene and revival of private equity interest on the gold front.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Arenson, for these nuggets, I want to say, of knowledge. Thank you. So now let's take a quick look at the results of our second and last survey of the day. The question again, do you think the COVID-19 crisis will ultimately lead to positive change in the mining industry? Rather positive, 67%, yes, very positive, 19%, so overall very positive, only 13% rather negative. Thank you again for taking part in this survey. And now, well, this sort of like brings our discussion to the last point of the day, which is to discuss Africa's new path to new normal and what it means to the industrialization of the continent, which is a continent that I have to say again, heavily relies on exporting raw material resources, notably to China. In certain countries, such as the DRC, for cobalt and copper, for instance, the sector represents over 97% of all exports. This is huge. So I have a question for each of our panelists. Again, I would ask you to be quite short with your answers so that we'll have time for our Q&A section. I will start with Mrs. Mashile-Nkosi. Mrs. Mashile-Nkosi, as an African-owned mining company, how do you see the days ahead for the industrialization of the continent, please?
I think industrialization of the continent will be based on the beneficiation of our minerals. Until such time that Africa has a contract that creates jobs and not export jobs from Africa. What I mean is that China continues in its quest to be a price determinant rather than a price taker. Africa will also continue to the biggest loser during COVID and post-COVID. And therefore, it means until Africa decides that we need to create jobs for the African people by actually creating opportunities, beneficiating in our own countries, and actually selling finished products to China rather than exporting raw ore and buying it back as a finished product from China, because we are at the mercy of China. And for instance, in the manganese sector now, they actually decided that because the price was so high, they stockpile and the price comes tumbling down. So until we decide, as Africans, that we'll have to act in the best interest of Africa, because we cannot expect China to act in the best interest of Africa. They act in the best interest of the Chinese people.
Thank you very much. So transformation there, according to you, is one of the big way ahead for the continent. And I naturally turn to you, Mr. Diakite. China is one of the shareholders of your company. So as an international consortium, what benefits do you see in African industrialization, and how, above all, do we guarantee win-win relationship when we export raw commodities?
For me, no doubt that we need to focus on the value chain. How much small companies, how much locals are involved in business as suppliers, as contractors, to give more value added to not only our product by increasing their effect on the general economy. So for me, supporting the foreign direct investment by creating more businesses and developing and spreading the whole effect on the whole economy through a value chain will be the factor of innovation, creativity, and I would say beneficiation to people, starting at the bottom, to the local level, up to the elite. So for me, this is the really challenge, how to make the mining sector open enough to attract and contract locals and involving in the business. And right now, we can be involved in all the areas of the mining. From drilling to transport, you can find African business people to be involved in.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this, Mr. Diakite. And now to Mr. Bastos for the last question before our Q&A segment. Can the African Continental Free Trade Area be part of the solution, I want to ask? And here, I'll remind our participants that we had the pleasure in receiving a few weeks ago, Wankele Mene, who's the Secretary General of the African Continental Trade. And among other things, he expressed his vision for the continent and the fact that he hopes that the continent will in the future export less raw materials and transform more locally, as also suggested by Mrs. Mashile-Nkosi. So, Mr. Bastos, what do you think about this? Is this the way ahead? Can this indeed help capture revenues which are until now slipping away from our states, and what else can be done indeed?
I think the free trade area might be part of the solution if we think over-reliance on extra-continental trade is the only problem. But the problem is if you only have a free trade market, you don't solve the problem. I mean, the problem, as Ms. Mashile said, is to build or rebuild the Africa productive base and to keep the value chain and value added in Africa. So what does it mean? It means processing locally. It means using resources for broad base and including development. And just to finish with opening remark, while I'm speaking, I just recall what Mr. Diakite says, and just hoping probably, and I hope very soon to have a strong Pan-African consortium doing jumbo deals in Africa. That should be the goal, and it's achievable. And as Ms. Mashile said, we can blame everyone, and we can blame foreign people, but the reality is Africa and African governments has their role, and they have the ability to take on that challenge.
Thank you very much. I thank you all as well for keeping your answers quite brief. I really appreciate that because I know there's so much to be said. So thank you. Let's go directly now to the questions sections. And first of all, 2 questions that were sent ahead of our discussion by our participants. What was your biggest challenge in terms of business continuity? And this is a question from David Morel, who's Regional General Manager at Africa International SOS. And I will ask Mr. Diakite first. So what was your biggest challenge in terms of business continuity, please?
The business continuity, again, as Mr. Mion was saying during his introductions, is something which the mining sector is living with. We always try to predict all the events that can be a source of threat or a source of risk to disrupt our productions. That's why we are stockpiling in the mining site, we are stockpiling in the port, and we are trying to organize a shift so that in front of any unpredictable events, we are able to continue. That's one thing. The second thing is really in terms of OPEX, you know, we always ensure that we have enough inventories to ensure that we have spare parts, we have people, and we have procedures to face any challenges that can come and disrupt. The last side now is with the government, you know. We need to be really compliant with all the requirements, be legal or standard. So with these 3 factors, business resilience and business continuities are somehow assured. You know, now, the remaining side is how to manage the stakeholders. Most importantly, the unions. So we are endowed with resources to control the unions, to ensure that the continuous dialogue is taking place and that no social peace is disrupted because of non-compliance or non-fulfillment of our corporate social responsibility.
Thank you very much. And I would like to ask you the same question, Mrs. Mashile-Nkosi. And talking about the unions, they have been quite vocal in South Africa, actually.
Thank you very much. I think, yes, one of the biggest problems was that because COVID was new, no one knew anything. As Ismael said again, that risk mitigation is part of our planning as the mining sector. Regulation, compliance, standards that were new for us, permits for people to move from their home to the places of work. We had people being arrested because the police were as confused as we were. So those were some of the issues. The testing, what the difference between testing, the difference between monitoring people, the quarantine facilities and so on. So for us, those were some of the risks that we actually faced for us to continue. We didn't want to send people underground to work before we actually understood what was social distancing. But the biggest challenge for us was PPE, the masks, the N95 versus your other masks, social distancing, the sanitizers, and so on. So for us, those were some of the things. It took 2 weeks for us to actually get, you know, our plans in place, and from there it was business as usual. And for now, we don't have those issues, and hence the numbers of infections, because we screen people on a daily basis. We have only 1 case. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I have a question as well for Mr. Bastos. This is coming from Hamed Batili, Senior Claims Officer at Activa Liberia. And he asks, with the impact the crisis has on the entire world economy, can insurance companies afford providing cover for such a pandemic? Is there, if there is, any such possibility, and to what extent?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I mean, the insurance and also reinsurance players are global players, so we have to bear that in mind. So mining is part of their activities, and generally they leverage the portfolio. So what probably, and just trying to be prospective, but what probably the trend will be that de-risking the portfolio because mining is I mean, we have many sectors in the economy, and the insurance is put at stress. So just to say things straight, the problem will probably would the insurance companies bear the risk? That's the question. And if they bear the risk, at what cost? Because finally we are talking about insurance premiums. So the cost issue will be a big issue. Let's remind that in many sectors, pandemic is always it might be excluded from contracts. So probably the COVID has put a focus on that the pandemic can be a reality. And so what, as a lawyer, what probably we can expect is the pandemic thing will probably be a big negotiation issue, which wasn't a couple of weeks ago. So again, very difficult to answer, but that's what I can say.
Well, you have answered, so thank you very much indeed. Now there's a question from one of our participants. His name is Mamadouli, and he asked, what would be the post-COVID measures from mining companies to make sure the supply chain is not interrupted in the future by another pandemic? So looking ahead again, and I would like to ask Mr. Diakite, please, to answer. Would you like me to repeat the question again? What would be the post-COVID measures from mining companies to make sure the supply chain is not interrupted in the future by another pandemic?
Good questions. Again, mining is about planning. It's about people. It's about process. You know, we are always working under some, I would say, permanent and rigorous rules of health and safety. You know, we have learned from Ebola. We are now learning for something which is more fatal than Ebola because it's asymptomatic and it's lead to death of people and threat of community and anxiety. Therefore, we know now that this kind of event can emerge. Therefore, we'll be more prepared. We'll be more prepared not only for our employees and their family, but prepared for the communities. That means that we'll invest more in training people, in creating confinement space, in creating maybe some new personal protective equipment, and so on and so forth. Also, it's shown that as we did this time, we have to work with the government because after all, pandemic is about state first responsibility because public health is in the hand of the government, and public health management is governed by public rules. Therefore, we have to work more with government, with community, and international donors to ensure that we are all in the same lines, ready to confront and to contain any epidemic. So the post-COVID plan is really more investment in equipment and process and the treatment. That's something which we are thinking about right now.
Thank you very much. And very, very quickly, as we are reaching the end time of our webinar, I would like to ask you three, what are your forecasts in 2020 for the mining business? And I'll go to you first, Mr. Bastos. Very briefly, please.
Again, that's a tough question. Generally, the financier do the forward-looking statements, but mining is already engaged in deep trends very quickly. ESR, green mining, technology, and as we see more focus on the pandemic is expected to accelerate trends, especially in environmental investment, digitalization. So probably some say we can expect in the near future a boom in copper, cobalt, lithium. I mean, everything around the low carbon economy.
Thank you very much. Digitalization there mentioned also by Mrs. Mashile-Nkosi. So I would like to answer now, Mrs. Please, what are your forecasts in 2020 for the mining business, please?
I think our focus for the mining business in our case in 2020 is to ramp up and actually begin to put the finished product, because that's what we do, beneficiate 3 million tons of manganese ore into the international market to attract foreign direct investment and recover from COVID-19.
Thank you. So ramping up there. Thank you very much. And finally to you, Mr. Diakite, please, what are your forecasts for this year, please? Oh, sorry, there is an issue with your microphone there.
No, it's okay. Of course, we have taken a huge commitment regarding Simandou. So Simandou will be at the core of our commitment, our engagement on the road. Of course, Simandou will go together with anything related to continue controlling, containing, and preventing our people to get COVID-19, to ensure that we are in full compliance with all the prevention measures that the government has put in place. And second, I'm sure that we have already started to change our working, I would say, patterns. Now, instead of being spread over the country, we have to concentrate in some specific place and create some, I would say, profit center where we'll concentrate our activities to ensure that we go in a very piecemeal way, step by step, not to be everywhere at the same time and expose people, and use digitalization as a tool of communication, a tool of management. That's, but again, as Mr. Mion said, it will be somehow business as usual, but the new normal element will come to improve our way of working. Mining will not be as it used to be. We need to change a bit. We need to adapt to the situation.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all three of you for taking part in this fascinating conversation today. You've all brought something very, very special to this discussion. So I would like to thank you very, very much. So before we leave, I would like to remind you of the next webinar, which will take place on the 16th of this month. Here is the theme for you: COVID-19 backs in the eye of the storm. And the final webinar of this particular series in partnership with Asafo & Co will be on July the 23rd. And during this webinar, which I'll have the pleasure to moderate again, we'll be asking whether we should cancel the Africans' debt, and that will be in French. So this is for our French speakers. You can also, by the way, see a list of all the upcoming webinars on the website, and also watch the previous ones through the replays. And I would also like to take the opportunity to announce that the Africa CEO Forum is launching its very first ever 100% digital event addressed to African family businesses. This is a first. And that's more than 300 of Africa's most influential family businesses, which will gather online on the 1st and the 2nd of October this year. So I want to ask, are you part of a family business? Well, registrations are opened, so please secure a place ASAP. They will go very, very fast indeed. And you can do that through the link that you can see on your screens right now. And even if you're not part of a family business, I want to say, but want to recommend one, if you know any family businesses that you would like to recommend, please feel free to contact us at Family Business. That's one word, at the forum, the Africa Forum, africaceoforum.com, sorry. So finally, like I said, this webinar will be on replay on the Africa CEO Forum's website. Please feel free to watch again and share indeed. We are very interested in your opinion, as you know, so you will receive very shortly in your emails a short questionnaire. I invite you to please fill and send back. I thank you once again, all of our participants, all of our distinguished guests today to have taken part in our discussion. They are Christian Mion, Bob Bastos, Daphne Mashile-Nkosi, Ismael Diakite, Jacob Grierson, and Gaelle Arenson. My name is Anne-Marie Diaz-Borges, and I thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.